Outlaws attack weak old man. They freeze when they see his tribal tattoo. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The old man lived where the road forgot to look back. His cabin leaned into the wind like it was tired of standing, boards bleached by years of sun and dust. He was thin now, shoulders bowed, hands slow from age and cold mornings. Folks in the nearest town knew him only as the quiet one who traded rabbit skins for flour and kept to himself. On that afternoon the sky burned pale and the land lay open for miles, a place where sound carried and mercy did not. 3 riders came out of the shimmer, hooves cutting the dirt, laughter loose and careless. They saw the old man first, not the cabin, and that was enough. They circled him as he bent to lift a bucket, their shadows long and sharp. One asked his name and did not wait for an answer. Another told him to hand over what little he had. The third smiled like this was a game he had played too many times to count. The old man straightened with effort. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not raise his voice. He looked at the ground, as if weighing whether words were worth the breath. The riders mocked his silence. They called him weak. They called him nothing. One stepped close and shoved him, not hard enough to break bone, just enough to make a point. Dust rose. The old man stumbled and caught himself on the fence rail. Laughter followed. They searched him with rough hands, finding a few coins, a folded cloth, nothing that pleased them. Anger sharpened their smiles. One grabbed the front of his shirt and yanked, meaning to tear, meaning to humiliate. Cloth slid down over old skin weathered like the land. And then it happened. The laughter died without a word. The air changed. On the old man's chest, faded by years but unmistakable, lay a tribal tattoo. The lines were careful. The marks were not made for show. They were marks of oath and witness, the kind given when a life was spared and a promise kept. The rider who held the shirt let go as if burned. Another took a step back, eyes fixed, breath caught. The third swallowed hard, color leaving his face. None of them reached for a gun. None of them spoke. The old man stood there, steady now, not proud, not afraid. He did not explain. He did not threaten. He simply pulled the cloth back into place with slow hands. Wind moved through the grass. Somewhere a bird called. The riders remembered stories their fathers told, and the way those stories always ended in silence. They remembered names that were not spoken lightly, and signs that meant you had crossed a line long before you knew it existed. The road felt longer suddenly. The sun felt closer. The old man met their eyes once, only once, and that was enough to stop what had begun. The old man's name was Elias Crow when he was born, though almost no one alive still called him that. To the town he was simply the old man by the dry creek, the one who walked slow and spoke softer than the wind. He had lived on that land for more than 40 years, measuring time not by calendars, but by winters survived and fences repaired. His cabin sat nearly 7 miles from the nearest road, and more than 15 miles from town, close enough that he could walk there in a long day if he had to, but far enough that no one ever came by accident. Every board in that cabin carried his hands in it. Every post in the fence had been set when his back was straight, and his hair still held its color. He woke before sunrise not because he had work waiting, but because his body no longer allowed sleep to linger. He boiled coffee over a small stove fed with mesquite, and listened to the land come alive. The old man owned little and needed even less. A rifle hung above the door and used for many seasons. A pair of boots sat by the bed, patched so many times they looked like they belonged to someone else. On a shelf rested a folded blanket woven with care, given long before his beard turned white. He had earned that blanket with nothing but patience and a promise kept when promises were rare. In town some said he had once been a fighter, others said he had been a guide, and a few whispered that he had lived among the tribes, when living among them meant choosing a side. The truth was quieter than all of that. Elias had been young once and foolish enough to think strength meant taking. He learned otherwise the night a fire burned where a camp had stood, and children cried for parents who would not answer. He did not lift a weapon that night. He stood between fear and fury and paid for it with scars that never showed. In return he was given a mark not of ownership, but of trust, ink pressed into skin by hands that shook not from fear, but from age. It was not a badge to boast of. It was a reminder that a life spared weighs heavier than one taken. He wore long sleeves for decades not to hide the tattoo, but because it belonged to a time that did not need repeating. The land knew him better than people did. He repaired what broke. He left water where travelers might find it. When a child from town once wandered too far chasing a lizard, it was Elias who walked the boy home without asking for thanks. He never married. He never explained why. He buried friends alone under cottonwoods and said words meant only for the dead. By the time the riders found him that afternoon, his body had thinned, but his presence had not. The dust on his boots told a longer story than his silence. The sun marked the lines on his face like a map of all the years he had chosen restraint over rage. And as the wind carried away the last echo of laughter from the road, Elias Crow stood rooted in the same place he had chosen long ago, knowing that the land remembers even when men forget. The riders did not leave right away. Silence held them for a moment, and then cruelty crept back in like a bad habit remembered. One of them laughed too loud to prove he was not afraid. Another spat into the dirt and said the old man was just a relic pretending to matter. They began again, not with fists, but with words sharpened to cut. They asked where he hid his money and where he hid his friends. They told him no mark on skin could stop what they wanted. Elias Crow listened without lifting his eyes. He had learned long ago that anger feeds on attention. The riders stepped closer and crowded his space. A hand pressed against his shoulder and pushed him back toward the fence. Wood creaked. Dust lifted. The old man caught himself and did not fall. That seemed to anger them more. One rider said an old body breaks easy, and said age makes men forget how pain works. Another reached for the bucket and kicked it over, watching water spill into thirsty ground. Elias felt the loss like a quiet ache. Water was time here. He said nothing. They searched the cabin next. A door opened and closed hard. A boot kicked a stool. A hand swept a shelf bare. They found little and mocked what they found. Coins counted and dismissed. A blanket lifted and tossed aside. A rifle taken down and set back up when they saw it had not been cared for in years. They wanted fear and did not get it. That made them crueler. They returned to him and circled again. One tugged at his sleeve and demanded to see the mark again, as if proof might erase what they felt. Elias did not resist. Cloth moved, and the tattoo showed for a breath. The riders looked and looked away. One cursed under his breath. Another shook his head as if trying to wake from a dream. Still they pressed. One said stories grow and shrink and mean nothing out here. Another said the tribes were gone and their signs were dead. Elias finally spoke, not loud and not long. He said the land keeps its own memory. His voice was thin but steady. It carried just enough to reach them. The riders did not like the sound of it. They shoved him again, and he stumbled to one knee. Pain shot through his leg and settled like winter. He stayed there, breathing slow. He did not beg. The riders paused. The youngest looked at the tattoo and then at Elias' face. He saw not defiance, but something older. Something that did not need permission. He remembered a story told by firelight about a man who stood between a knife and a child and paid for it with blood and years. He remembered the warning that followed. Do not cross a promise you do not understand. The youngest rider swallowed and stepped back. The leader noticed and snapped at him to stand firm. He raised his hand as if to strike again and stopped short. The wind moved through the grass and the quiet pressed in. Elias rose slowly, using the fence for balance. He brushed dirt from his knee with care. He looked at them all and said nothing else. No threat came. No plea followed. Just a look that held weight. The riders felt it. Fear had not left them, but it had changed shape. It was no longer about the old man. It was about what they had begun and what it might call down the road. One by one their voices fell away. They did not apologize. They did not promise. They backed off a step and then another. Pride fought sense and lost. When they turned their horses, the youngest looked back once more. He nodded without knowing why. Elias Crow watched them go until dust settled. He stood alone again with the land and the water gone, and the quiet returned. The day moved on. He bent to right the bucket and filled it from his spare jug. The mark on his chest faded back under cloth. He had endured worse and asked for nothing. The land took note. When the dust finally settled and the road fell quiet, Elias Crow moved with the careful patience age had taught him. He lifted the fallen stool and set it upright. He gathered the coins from the dirt and placed them back on the shelf. He righted the blanket and smoothed it as if calming a restless child. Only then did he sit on the edge of his bed and let the moment reach him. His chest felt tight not from fear, but from memory. He loosened his shirt and looked down at the tattoo, now hidden again. The ink had softened over the years, but the meaning had not. It was not a mark of rank or a warning sign. It was a witness mark. It told a story without words and demanded restraint from those who understood. Elias traced the lines with a fingertip and felt the weight of the day. He earned it. The day had begun with smoke rising too fast and the sound of running feet. He had been young and strong, then traveling light and believing he could pass through any trouble if he kept his head down. He could not. He found a camp breaking apart under fear and confusion. He found elders trying to hold order and children pressed into the dirt by panic. He found anger rushing like a river with no banks. Elias stepped into that river and paid for it. He took a blow meant for a smaller body. He stood where standing mattered. When the shouting stopped and the night came, he did not ask for thanks. He asked for water and silence. At dawn, an old woman pressed ink into his skin with steady hands and told him the mark meant he had seen and would remember. It meant he would not turn away the next time memory called. Back in the present, Elias pulled his shirt closed and breathed until the tightness eased. Outside, the wind shifted and carried the smell of dust and sage. He walked to the door and looked toward the road where the riders had gone. He did not expect them to return, but he knew the land had a way of bringing back what it needed to settle. He filled the bucket again and set it where a traveler might find it. He placed a cup beside it. Small acts still mattered. As the sun slid lower, a shadow crossed the ground and Elias turned. A boy from town stood at the fence holding a paper parcel. He looked unsure and young, but not frightened. Elias waited. The boy cleared his throat and said his mother sent bread. He said he saw riders on the road and thought the old man might need company. Elias nodded and thanked him. He did not invite him in. The boy did not ask. He set the parcel down and lingered a moment looking at the cabin and the quiet. He asked if Elias was all right. Elias said yes. The boy smiled and left. Elias watched him go and felt the mark on his chest warm as if agreeing. The tattoo was a small thing made of lines and patience, but it had reached beyond skin today. It had spoken to fear without raising a voice. It had turned cruelty inward where it belonged. As dusk came, Elias sat on the step and listened to the land settle. He knew the riders would carry the sight with them. He knew stories would shift and soften, but the mark would remain clear in the minds that mattered. It was enough. He closed his eyes and let the evening take the rest. The night deepened, and with it came a stillness that felt deliberate, as if the land itself was holding breath. Elias Crow remained awake longer than usual, seated near the door with his back straight and his hands resting on his knees. He did not expect trouble, yet he felt a shift that had nothing to do with sound. Far down the road, the riders had stopped. They had not planned to. Their horses sensed the pause before the men did. One rider dismounted and stared back toward the cabin, though distance swallowed its shape. Another wiped his mouth and tried to speak, but no words came that felt right. The youngest stood apart with his arms folded tight against his chest. He kept seeing the mark as it had appeared for a brief instant, like a truth uncovered by accident. He knew the symbol, though he had never worn it. He had seen it carved on a post near a creek where elders once met. He had seen it scratched into a stone beside a grave that was kept clean by hands no one saw. The mark meant a vow held by the living and the dead together. It meant the bearer had chosen to stand when turning away would have been easier. The leader tried to shake it off and said the old man was nothing but age and dust. He said marks fade and stories lie. Yet his voice lacked force. The men did not laugh. Silence answered him, and silence carried weight. They remembered other silences from other roads when a choice had been made and consequences followed. Back at the cabin, Elias felt the quiet settle around him like a shawl. He knew the moment had passed, but its echo had not. He rose and stepped outside, letting the night air cool his skin. Stars spread clean and sharp overhead. He walked to the fence and rested his hand on the post he had set long ago. The land had a way of confirming what mattered. He closed his eyes and saw again the old woman with steady hands, and the ink pressed into skin, not to claim, but to remind. The mark was never meant to frighten. It was meant to stop a hand mid-motion. It had done so today without a word. On the road, the riders turned at last and rode on slower than before. Each mile felt longer. Each sound felt louder. They did not speak of what they had seen, but the seeing stayed with them. The youngest thought of his mother and the way she had taught him to leave water where it might be found. He thought of the rule she gave him before she died, which was simple and hard. Do not take from those who stand between harm and the small. He wondered when he had crossed it. Elias returned inside and set a kettle to warm. He poured water into a cup and drank slow. He did not feel triumph. He felt relief that no more harm had been done. The mark had worked not as a threat, but as a mirror. It showed men who they were becoming and asked if they wished to continue. Outside, the night insects sang and the wind moved through grass. Time resumed its patient pace. Far away, a rider looked back once more and felt a chill that had nothing to do with cold. He knew he would carry the sight into every choice that followed. Elias Crow sat and listened and let the quiet do the rest. Morning came slow and pale and found Elias Crow awake with the same quiet readiness he carried through every season. He stepped outside and read the ground as he always did and saw the truth written there. Fresh tracks had turned away in the night, not hurried, but heavy, as if the riders carried more than they arrived with. He followed the line with his eyes and then let it go. The land had taken its share and would keep the rest. He returned to his chores and moved through them with care. He split a small stack of wood and set it to dry. He checked the fence and reset a loose wire. He worked until his hands warmed and his breath found its rhythm. The mark on his chest stayed hidden and did not ask for attention. By late morning, a rider appeared from the town side alone and unarmed. He dismounted far from the cabin and waited by the fence with his hat in his hands. Elias saw the posture and understood the difference. He walked out to meet him and stopped a few steps away. The man spoke first and named himself as Thomas Reed, a clerk who had watched roads long enough to know when trouble changed direction. He said 3 riders had passed through town at dawn, quiet and unsettled. He said the youngest asked for water and paid fare and left a coin for a widow who sold bread. He said stories had already begun to move, and he wanted to hear the truth before they twisted. Elias listened and said little. He told Thomas that a mark does not work alone. It only speaks to those who already know how to listen. He said the riders chose their own, ending by stopping when they did. Thomas nodded and looked toward the hills. He said some marks mean blood and some mean restraint, and the men he saw looked like they had met the second. Elias thanked him for the visit and offered water. Thomas drank and left with lighter steps. When the day warmed, a pair of travelers stopped at the bucket and filled their canteens. They did not knock. They did not ask questions. They moved on, grateful and unchanged. That was how Elias preferred it. In the afternoon, the boy from town returned carrying a message from his mother, who asked if Elias would speak to the school children about maps and water and safe paths. Elias considered and agreed. He walked the distance before sunset and stood before the small room with dust on his boots and a calm in his voice. He spoke of reading the land and leaving water and choosing the long way when the short way cut through someone else's fear. He did not speak of the mark. He did not need to. The children listened and learned the parts that mattered. As dusk fell, Elias returned home with the quiet settling behind him. He sat on the step and watched the sky darken. He thought of the old woman and the night of smoke and the promise that followed. He thought of how the mark had done its work without harm. He knew the riders would carry the memory farther than any threat could reach. The truth had taken root not as fear, but as understanding. When the stars came out, Elias stood and went inside. He closed the door and let the day in, knowing that justice had arrived not on horseback, but as a pause that changed direction. The tension that lingered did not rise into violence, but settled into a narrow ridge where choice mattered more than strength. Late that afternoon, a cloud of dust appeared again on the far road, and Elias Crow paused his work. He did not reach for the rifle. He wiped his hands and waited. 3 riders came into view slower than before and stopped well short of the fence. They did not circle. They did not laugh. Their horses stood with heads low as if they too sensed a line that should not be crossed. The leader dismounted first and removed his hat. He took several steps forward and stopped. His voice carried but did not push. He said they had come to finish what they started or to end it the right way. He did not know which until he stood there. Elias met his eyes and said nothing. Silence pressed in and held. The youngest rider dismounted next and stood apart. He looked at the ground and then at the cabin and then back to Elias. He took a breath and said the mark on the old man's chest had been carved into his memory. He said his grandmother had spoken of it as a sign given to those who choose to stand between harm and the small. He He said seeing it had stopped his hand before it could do worse. The leader shifted and cleared his throat. He said they had taken water and spilled it, and that was a poor thing to do in a dry place. He set a sack on the ground and nudged it forward with his boot. Inside were supplies they could spare: flour, coffee, and a coil of wire. He said they did not ask forgiveness. He said they asked to leave without adding to the harm already done. Elias listened and let the wind pass between them. He looked at the sack and then at the riders. He nodded once. He said the land does not keep accounts the way men do. He said leaving now was the right direction. No one smiled. No one relaxed fully. The riders stepped back. The youngest hesitated and then stepped forward a pace and asked if the old man would show the mark again, not to test but to remember. Elias did not move at first. Then he loosened his shirt just enough for the lines to be seen. He did not speak of how it was earned. He did not name those who gave it. He let the sight do its work. The youngest bowed his head and stepped back. The leader replaced his hat and mounted. The riders turned their horses away from the cabin. They did not look back. Elias waited until they were gone and then bent to lift the sack. He carried it inside and set it by the wall. He did not feel victory. He felt the quiet satisfaction of a thing set right without breaking anything else. As evening came, the boy from town arrived again with his mother this time and a basket of vegetables. She thanked Elias for speaking to the children and said the road felt safer already, though no one could say why. Elias said roads change when people do. She left with a lighter step. Night gathered and Elias sat on the step and watched the stars. He knew the riders would carry the pause with them. He knew no lawman would come and none was needed. The mark had done what it was meant to do. It had turned cruelty into a moment of choice and guided that choice toward restraint. Elias closed his eyes and let the night finish the day. The days that followed did not bring celebration or rumor, but a steady easing, as if a tight knot had been loosened without anyone naming the hands that did it. Elias Crow went on with his routines and found them lighter. He repaired a stretch of fence near the creek and noticed fresh tracks that stopped and turned away where trouble once pressed forward. He left water at the post and saw it taken and replaced with care. In town, the clerk Thomas Reed heard fewer raised voices at the counter and more quiet exchanges at the pump. Travelers lingered long enough to thank the woman, who sold bread and moved on without swagger. The road remembered the pause. One evening, the youngest rider returned alone, not to the cabin, but to the edge of the land where the bucket stood. He dismounted and drank and sat on the ground with his back against the post. He did not cross the fence. He waited until Elias noticed him and then spoke plain. He said his name was Samuel and said he would not ride with the others anymore. He said the sight of the mark had broken a habit that grew like rust. He said he would head east and work honest and send money back to his sister. Elias listened and nodded and wished him safe miles. Samuel left before night and did not look back. Weeks passed and the season shifted. Children from town walked the long way to learn paths and water signs and returned with stories of birds and stones and safe turns. Elias spoke when asked and kept silent when not. He never explained the mark. He never needed to. Its work had been done in the moment it stopped a hand and turned a horse. One afternoon, a storm rolled in fast, and travelers took shelter at the cabin. Elias shared coffee and space, and then sent them on with dry feet and better sense. No one pressed for tales. They saw the lines on his face and understood enough. When the storm cleared, the land smelled clean. Justice did not arrive with a posse or a rope. It arrived as an ending chosen early and a beginning taken quietly. Those who meant harm found a reason to turn away. Those who needed water found it. Elias Crow stood at the fence and watched the sun lower and felt the weight of years settle right. The mark under his shirt did not burn or call. It rested. He had not won anything. He had simply kept a promise that asked for restraint and patience. The road changed because people changed. The town slept easier because fear had been answered without force. Elias closed the gate and went inside and set the kettle to warm. Outside, the stars came out and held their places. The land took note and moved on. The last light of the season came gentle and even and found Elias Crow doing what he had always done, which was to tend the small things that keep a place honest. He mended a loose hinge and swept dust from the step and set the bucket where it could be seen from the road. He moved slower now, but with the same care he had carried for decades. The land answered him with quiet. When evening settled, he sat and watched the sky change color and thought of the many endings he had witnessed that did not need witnesses. He thought of the night long ago when smoke rose and fear pressed close, and a choice had been made to stand instead of turn away. He had carried that choice as a mark beneath his shirt and as a habit in his hands. The mark had spoken once more and then gone still. That was how it was meant to be. A thing does its work and then rests. In town, a child learned a safer path home, and a widow sold bread without worry. On the road, a young man rode east with a lighter burden and a clearer purpose. None of them would say the old man name when they spoke of the change. They would speak of a pause and a feeling and a sense that some lines should not be crossed. That was enough. Elias rose and went inside and poured water and drank and set the cup back where it belonged. He folded the blanket and placed it at the foot of the bed. He loosened his shirt and felt the cool air and then covered the mark again. He did not look at it. He did not need to. He lay down and listened to the night and felt gratitude without ceremony. Days passed, and then more days, and the road remained a road, and the land remained the land. Trouble did not disappear, but it learned to turn earlier. Elias grew older and thinner and kinder in the way that comes from choosing restraint again and again. When winter came, he shared heat, and when spring returned, he shared water. He did not preach. He did not boast. He lived. One morning he walked to the fence and rested his hand on the post, and looked out at the long miles and smiled once at nothing anyone could see. Justice had come and gone without noise. It had arrived as a moment, when a hand stopped and a horse turned, and men chose to leave without adding to the harm. It had left behind no scars and no graves. Only a quieter road and a steadier town and an old man still standing. When the sun climbed, Elias returned to his work and the day moved forward. Out here, justice did not need words or guns or crowds. It only needed a person willing to hold a line and let the rest decide what to do with it. Experience a powerful tale of dignity, restraint, and quiet justice set in the American frontier, where an old man faces cruelty without raising a weapon and changes the course of those who confront him. This cinematic narrative follows a forgotten figure whose past carries a meaning deeper than violence, revealing how character, memory, and moral courage shape lives long after the moment passes. Told in the tradition of Western stories, this emotional journey explores how true strength is found in patience and how justice can arrive without bloodshed. Through vivid landscapes, human choices, and a silence that speaks louder than gunfire, this story reflects the soul of Western stories, where honor matters more than force and compassion redraws the map of right and wrong. Perfect for listeners who value thoughtful storytelling, this is one of those Western stories that lingers in the mind, reminding us that the West was built not only by conflict, but by people willing to stand still and choose restraint. If you are drawn to Western stories that focus on humanity, redemption, and the quiet power of doing what is right, this story offers a moving and unforgettable experience.